Okay, in this workshop, we are going to build out a pretty cool feature, and we're going to learn a lot about React and React Router as well in as we go through the process. So what we're going to build out here, I have the final version loaded up here, is if anybody remembers back when we created the drag and drop playlist feature a few months ago, I'm going to use that kind of as a starter. We're not going to do anything related to drag and drop, but a very common feature that I am asked to build and that you as a developer will be asked to build is the ability to dynamically change the layout based on a user's preference. So if you've ever been to a website or opened up an app and you saw that you had the ability to do things like change the layout from a row to a grid layout or to add filters, we're going to see how we can do that ourselves in this guide. So I have the final version right here. And as you can see, it starts off with a row layout. And we have these other filters up here. And if you click on the little grid icon, you'll see that we have the ability to switch the entire layout instantly and render it differently. You'll also see that different content is shown. Not only are the images changed and things like that, but also in the grid layout, we show some of the lyrics from these songs. And so these are all just some examples of kind of showing you not only can we change the layout, we can also change exactly what gets rendered. And additionally, when you click grid, you'll see that we have these filters added. If you toggle between the two, you can see these filters only show up when you have the grid layout showing, and you have the ability to select the newest items, you can clear it out, you can select it, and it's sorting by the release date value right here. So by the end of it, you're going to know how to build all of this out. One other thing that you may or may not notice is when I'm doing this, one thing that annoys the heck out of me when I'm on an application is when the application doesn't maintain its state in between actions. So for example, right here, many times I've seen apps where I'll change the layout, I'll have it set up exactly like how I want, and then I will maybe refresh the page or come to it later. And if I refresh the page on some of those other sites, it switches to the default and it loses my filters and all of those kinds of things. And that's kind of annoying. With what I have built out here, we're actually going to see how we can tie into the router itself and that router engine and pass in custom parameters up here in the URL bar so that when I hit refresh here, it loses this filter here, but it maintains the right layout. So what we're doing is we're actually going to learn how we can leverage React Router to help us maintain those state transitions to give a better user experience. And so I think this is going to be a fun guide. So let's get started. I'm going to switch to Visual Studio Code here and first go over our objectives. So we're going to model a React component that can take a collection of child components. So in other words, we're going to render through a list. Then we're going to work with React hooks to allow us to keep track of those different layouts and show them dynamically. We're going to build click handlers and work specifically with the routing engine to maintain that state. And then lastly, we're going to see how we can work with a select form field and have that alter the state and dynamically change that layout. So definitely, hopefully you'll get some good stuff out of this. I'm going to switch over into the starter branch. And this is going to give us where we're going to start today. And I'm going to start up the server. And in the meantime, I will also pull up. Let me go to Bottega here. So all of this code is on GitHub. I will send it in the chat. And for anybody watching later, I'm going to put this inside of inside the YouTube channel show notes. And so you'll have access to all of that. So like pull up chat and paste that link in there. As always, I don't really recommend for you to follow along as I'm typing because that can kind of lead to some frustration because you might miss something I said. I think the best approach with these workshops is to simply follow along, watch, and listen to exactly everything I'm doing. And then after that, take the code and start building it yourself or watch it a couple times. To get the starter version, come up here in GitHub and then click on starter. And this is how I'm going to be starting. This version is going to be the one that we will be going through. The master branch has the latest version of the code. So with all of that in place, let's get started. So I'm just going to go to the regular URL right here. And as you can see, we do not have our filters. And so that's good. That's exactly where we are starting. So let's open up our playlist component. I've added these for the imports because we're going to be using all of them. That's why they are kind of faded out. And as you can see, we have two components. We have a drag and drop playlist, and then we have a grid playlist. So we're not going to have to do anything inside of these. These are simply some components that maintain their own state, their own behavior. And that's one of the beautiful things about tools like React is they give you the ability to really isolate the type of features that you're wanting to work on. So in this case right here, this drag and drop playlist has all of the functionality for being able to drag and drop those elements, whereas this grid playlist here has a bunch of different features. So this has some different type of content that's shown. It has different CSS styles and it renders the items differently. So if I were to save the file now with the grid playlist, you'll see that now this is the default view that's shown. So how can we switch between those two? We're going to not only learn about React, React Router, and those kinds of things, we're also going to learn a little bit more about TypeScript as well. So we have these two components. We need the ability to toggle between them pretty easily. So first and foremost, I'm going to create a TypeScript type up here. And so I'm going to create a type here. I'm just going to call it view type. And for this type, this is where we're going to list out what those potential views could be. So one's going to be row, that's going to be the default, and I'll use the pipe operator here. And the next one's going to be grid. We could call these anything we want. And if you're not that familiar with TypeScript, it's perfectly fine. We're only going to be using it a little bit here. But one of the nice things about TypeScript is when I create a type like this, what it allows us to do is to very quickly get a reference for what the allowable values are. So if you're doing this in vanilla JavaScript and say you have 5 different layout versions, you'd always have to go and reference what the allowed name is. TypeScript actually is going to give us some nice autocomplete. So that's one of the big reasons why I like using it. Okay, so we have this type here. Now, how are we going to get access to be able to toggle between those? There's a couple different approaches. I'll kind of describe one of them and then we'll go implement the other one. So one approach is we could create a set of links here with the icons I showed, and then I would create click handlers. And whenever one of those icons gets clicked, then I could change the state. And that's a perfectly fine way to do it. The problem with that is that if I set those handlers up, there's no way for the application to know between page refreshes what happened, and it's going to go back to whatever the default is. That in some cases, that's perfectly fine, but I wanted to show you how you could actually leverage the React router engine to be able to maintain that state. So it's going to actually look like these different views are different routes in a sense. And if you're curious on how that is possible, I will open up the root app component here. And I've established a single route here, and it's pointing to the playlist component and how you can use optional params inside of React Router is inside of that path prop here, you can pass in the path to that component. And then by using a colon and then the name of a param, which in this case is view param, after that, you put a question mark. And what that's going to do with React Router is React Router is going to look for that route. So in our case, it's just the root route, which is your homepage type route. You could set this up if you had a large application. You could say, okay, the path for this one is going to be, playlist, and then it's going to point there. And then you're still going to have that optional parameter. But I want ours just on the home just to make it nice and easy. So that is this name right here, view param. This is a very important one because this is what we're going to have to look up inside of our playlist component. So and I will say, this is a much easier task to accomplish than this would have been even just a couple years ago. Ever since React hooks have came out, React Router really embraced the hook kind of methodology. And so they created a bunch of very helpful functions that are hooks that we can tie into. And we're going to work with several of them here. So I'm going to come up to the top here, and you can see I have already imported these. These are what we're going to call. Anytime in React you see the word use placed right in front of another word, that is the standard convention for a hook. So if you've ever been curious and you ever see the word use followed by some name, typically what that means is that this is a hook, which is really just a function. It gives us a nice, easy way to kind of tap into that behavior. So at the very top here, inside of this playlist function, I'm going to call a couple of these. The very first one I'm going to call is the history hook. So I'm going to say const history, and then I'm simply going to call use history and not pass in any params. The other one is that view param parameter. And so for that one, I'm going to say const, and then we're going to do some destructuring. I could do the same thing here. I could say const params equals use params. And what this does is this gives us access to those parameter values. So right up here where it says localhost 3000, and then when it says grid is the param. So all we're essentially trying to do is get access to this value. And so use params lets us get that value. Now, what history lets us do is it actually lets us tap into that value. It lets us set that. So right here, if I just call params like this, that's fine. But then anytime I wanted to use that, I would have to say params dot and then the value, which in our case is this view param value. And so I don't want to do that. I'm going to use destructuring for that. So with destructuring, that means I can do curly brackets and I can actually grab that parameter name. So in this case, that is view param. And then I want to also, TypeScript will complain about this if I don't tell it what to expect. And so I'm going to say view param, and this is going to be of type view param. And then that is going to be one of our view type options. So let's just test this. Let's just see if this is working. I'm going to put a console log here, and let's just get our param value. So view param, we're just going to console log this out, and let's see what it gives us. So I'll open up the console here and zoom in so you can see it. And so if I come up here and I type in grid, then you can see right here, it says param grid. So this is now giving us access to what we're needing. If I typed in row, then it says row. Now, technically, I could type anything in here I want. I could type anything and it'll give me that value. But in our case, because we're going to be using this for filtering and setting the layout, that really wouldn't be that helpful. So I'm going to just close that out. And now you can see param is undefined. This is going to be the default. When someone opens up the page, this is going to be the default value. And so what we want to do is we want to listen for that param. And then we also want to see a couple of things. If it exists, and then we want to see what the value is. And so let's start on that side. And we're going to use another hook in order to do that. So here, I can get rid of this console log statement. And I'm going to say react dot useEffect. UseEffect takes an anonymous function. And then we also it takes a second argument, and inside of these brackets, this lists out what we're wanting to listen for changes on. So in this case, we want to listen for changes with that view param value. Now, if you're not that familiar with the useEffect hook, what this does is it allows us to set up listeners and listen for changes, and they can pretty much be any type of change. You could listen for a change in a certain state value. If this is a component that takes in props, you could listen for changes in those prop values. And then inside of this function, we can have any type of process we want to run here. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to say first, if the view parameter exists, then I want to do something. So in this case, I want to be able to change the view that gets shown. And so let's create some state here. They'll help us keep track of that. So I'm going to create a piece of state here called view to show. And then I'm going to say set view to show. So if you don't do a lot with React hooks for state, what I'm doing here is I'm setting up a piece of state, kind of like a variable. But the nice thing about this variable is it comes with a getter. This will get us the value. And then it comes with a setter, which allows us to set or change that value. And because this is TypeScript, right after use state, I can define what values are allowed here. So in this case, it's view type. And we're going to start it off with being null, which means there's not going to be any value here. It's not going to be row or grid. It's just going to be empty. So when we check for that view parameter, now what I want to do inside of there is say, okay, if it exists, then I want to say set view to show to equal whatever that view parameter is. So now what that means is when the page loads, it's going to give us the ability to get access to view param. And then we can change this playlist component state, and then we can use it however we need. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using this to switch between these different layout types. So that's the first thing. Now, I also want to add the default action. So if view param is empty, if it's undefined, like we saw it's going to be in the beginning, if someone just goes to the home page, then I want to set the value. There's a couple ways to do this. So I'm going to say, so if that doesn't exist, I could just say, okay, well, in that case, set the view to show to be the row or the grid or whichever one you want to be default. That would work, but that would kind of give us a little bit of a data integrity issue, because in this case, what is going to happen is the view parameter will be empty, and then view to show is going to be set to row. I don't really like my data to be out of sync because that can lead to some confusing bugs. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the history hook to say history dot push, and now we can put in a value. So history push and then give the value of row. So if you want to think about what this flow is going to look like, and I can hit save here just to make sure I didn't introduce any bugs or anything. And so right now, if I just go to localhost 3000 and hit return, look at that. I didn't type row in, but the URL did get set. So when the page loaded, it checked for that value, that view param value. It saw that it wasn't there, and then it made the change. It pushed it. Now, this is the other really cool thing about how useEffect works is because we're listening for that view param, as soon as we made the change, as soon as we said history push this row value here, then it listened for that change. By the second time, it came through and it set that value. Hopefully that makes sense. This is a really cool way of doing it because in this case, we now have all of our data synced up. If someone goes to the page and they didn't type in that URL, then we have the ability to make sure that this view to show value is always going to be synced up with the param value. So that's everything that needs to be set there. So now that we have that, let's see how we can actually let this view value change the layout. So in this case, I'm going to uncomment this out. And inside of our layout, I'm going to say if view to show is equal to row, then I want to show this D&D playlist component. Now, if it is set to grid, so I'm going to say view to show is set to grid, then I want to show this grid playlist. And if you're curious about this syntax, if you haven't really seen this before, when you put in a conditional followed by the double ampersands, this is a more efficient way of writing a ternary operator. So a ternary operator can look kind of confusing if you don't deal with it a lot. It would look something like this. So I could say, const, some value, and then here I'll say, if name is equal to Hudgens, then I want to, do one thing. And if it's not, I don't want to do anything at all. So a lot of times you'll see ternary operators written out like this. If you have a conditional where if you want that to be true, you want one value shown. And if it's not true, then you don't want to do anything. Then you can actually use this syntax here, which is a really nice kind of cleaner way of writing that out. So that's all that we're doing here is this is a way of setting a condition. And if it's true, setting a different value. So let's hit save and we can test this out now. Our filters should be working simply based on the URL parameter. So that is showing our row-based layout. Now, if I type in grid, there we go. That's working beautifully. So we now are letting the route dictate the content that is shown. So it's the same component, but it's rendering a different set of values based on what that is. So that all looks great. Now, that's nice, but now let's actually take it and extend it a little bit so that we give our users the ability to do that by clicking on various links on the page. So to do that, I'm going to create a variable here called list filters, and it's just going to have some HTML or JSX code in here. So I'm going to say div dot, and for the class name here, I believed I use layout filter. And also that's something, if you're wondering about that syntax, VS Code, and I'm pretty sure it has it by default. Whenever you type in the name of some type of HTML tag followed by a dot, and then, some other name, something like that, as soon as you hit tab, it knows that you're wanting to create a div tag and that everything after the dot is going to be your class name. So that's kind of a helpful way of writing those out. So with that layout filter, we want to put some links in here. Now, we could do a regular link. So if we were building out this click handler and we wanted to be able to just set the state, I could create an A tag and create a on click handler. And inside of here, I could do something like say, set the view to show and let's set it equal to, well, row for the first one. And then I can even put our icons in here. Let me see the name of the icons. I have them up here. So we have the list filter first. So I could say list filter, and then I could add another one here and set the view to show to be the grid. And then there we go. And we could set this up, and this would work if we were going with that first option that I mentioned. So let's just add that in right now, just so you can kind of see it, because I like to show you when I can all of the different variations, because there's going to be some times where you would want these filters to be in the URL. There's other times where you would want to simply have some click listeners or click handlers in there. So let's hit save and come back. And you can see there are our links, and this all works nicely. So if I click here, it allows us to change those values. Notice though, it's not changing the URL. So that means that right here, that if we didn't have the whole URL in place, then if I click on, let me just do it right here, go to the home page, we're setting the row automatically. But if I click on grid, the URL didn't change. So now if I hit refresh, it loses that state. That's not what we're wanting to do in this case. I'd like to actually maintain that. So what I can do instead is I'm going to use a nav link. So this is from React Router. So I'm going to use a nav link, and I'm going to say I want the to value, in this case, to be row. And then let's put that icon in there, get rid of that tag. And then I'll replicate that down here. And then this one is going to be to grid. Hit save now. And let's see if this is working. So if I click on grid, that works, and it changed the URL. So now we have the ability to maintain that state. So this is working beautifully. As far as the high level functionality goes, we pretty much have it right here. Now, another thing that's kind of nice about this navlink component from React Router is it gives you the ability to have an active state. So what that means is I would like, and I think it's a good user interface kind of practice, whenever you have these kind of filters, you want to let the user know which filter is active and which one isn't. So I would like to change the color of these icons based on which one has the active value at the moment. Navlink as a component has a really helpful prop that allows for that. So first, we can add a base state here. So for a base state of like kind of the initial class name, this one's going to be layout dash filter and then dash dash default. And then we have a prop called active class name. And in that case, I'm going to say layout filter dash dash active. And I'm just going to copy all of this here. And we're going to apply it to the grid icon as well. So now if I hit state or save and come back here, now you can see we have our colors. And when I click on the list filter, it gives me the blue color there. If I click on grid, it changes that. And notice it happens even when you refresh the page. So that's pretty neat. If you want to inspect this with the browser, you can actually see it changing, which is one of the cool things about React and kind of watching how it slides that in. So right here, you can see this is the active value. So you see where it says class, and it gives us our default, and then it gives us active. If I were to click away from that, you can see that that has been removed. So that's what's happening behind the scenes is React Router has that nav link, which as you can see here is just an A tag. It's just a regular, all of this code, all of the React code you write gets rendered into something the browser can understand. So it gets rendered into an A tag, and then based on this value, it's listening for changes in the row as well, or in the param as well. It's listening for those, and it checks to see, is this the active value? If it is, then I want you to change the class name. If not, then just use the default one. So that's pretty cool. Kind of hopefully gives you a little idea of what's happening behind the scenes. And because we're using React Router, we didn't have to write any of that code ourselves. It listened for those changes. It made all of that. So that is working beautifully. So as far as changing the layout goes, we are done. We now have the ability to switch between this drag and drop row layout or the grid. So nice work going through that. Now, the next thing we need to do is we need to add in our list selector. So we want to be able to say, I want to sort these values here, and I want to sort by release date. Well, we're going to use the React select component, and I can show you the documentation for it here. It's a very helpful tool. I use it in pretty much every application that I work in, and has a lot of different options. So if you ever need a select box in React, this is a great one to go through and to implement. So I'm going to show you a few different parts of it in this guide. So first, let's create some options. So in order to have that select box, we need to set up what those selectable data options are going to be. So up top, outside of the component itself, and if you're curious on why I put some values in the component and some outside of it, it's just kind of a best practice when it comes to React on not putting any of your constant values, in other words, the values that aren't going to change, you place those outside of the component because it helps a little bit with performance. Because every time this component changes, you wouldn't want to be rebuilding and then tearing down the data points that are always going to be the same. So in this case, what we select is going to change, but the options themselves are going to be exactly the same. So I'm going to create a array here, and I'm going to call it sort options. And the reason why I'm using all caps there is because it really defines, when you look at it, you can tell this is a constant. This is a value that will not change. And this is going to be an array of objects. And React Select requires you to follow a certain naming process for any of the selectable options. So you need to have a label key, and that label is going to be what the end user sees. So in this case, I'm going to say newest, and then the value. This is going to be what we actually work with. So this is the data that we're going to be using. So in this one, I'm just going to say newest. The only difference is going to be this one isn't going to be capitalized. Now, a lot of times you'll see things like this. So in quite a few of my applications, you'll see some value here, like, search for something like like a paid status, or, something like that. And then the value will actually be like the database identifier. And so it's going to be a number. That's a very common thing that you'll see when you're working with these select boxes. But in our case, it's pretty basic. So I'm going to say newest, and then let's see, oldest. And so that's all we need for our sort options. Now, I already had here the sort filter state. So that's already here. This is what we're going to use to capture what values do get selected. We're going to set it up with null here in the beginning because we don't want to have any default select items. And then down here below, we're going to create another useEffect hook. So I'll say React, useEffect. But now we're going to be listening for a different change. Now we're going to be listening for that sort filter change. So here in the first useEffect, we're listening for changes in the params. Here we're going to be using it for sort filter. So first thing I'm going to say, if the sort filter, and I'm going to put a question mark here. This is something in TypeScript you can't do in vanilla JavaScript, but it's very helpful in TypeScript. If you've ever been annoyed at having to type out things like this, where you say if sort filter, because you want to make sure that it exists first, and then you say, okay, if sort filter dot value, and I've had times with deeply nested objects where you might have something like this, and then sort filter dot value dot something else, something like that. That chain could get really annoying to have to type in just to make sure that a value exists. With TypeScript now, with the latest versions, you can say if sort filter, add a question mark, and then say value, and you get to skip that. It's called optional chaining and makes a really nice way of being able to write the code. So, because if not, if I tried to call value on sort filter and sort filter didn't exist, the whole application would blow up, because it was trying to call a object key on an object that didn't even exist. And so I'm going to say if sort filter, first, if it exists, and then second, if the value is equal to newest, then I want to do one thing. And then else, if sort filter dot value is equal to oldest, then I want to do something else. And so what we're going to be doing is we have control over this playlist data. This is simply data that is being stored in the application. Normally, this would be coming from an API. In this case, it's just stored in the application itself. And this is just an array of objects that have different data points. This is everything that you see rendered on the screen, like an ID, title, artist, description, those things. And so what I want to do is when this value changes from newest to oldest, or if it doesn't even exist at all, then I want to change the sort order. And so what I can do is I can use a tool from Lodash, the library Lodash here, called order by. And so I can say set the playlist data, and then inside of there, I can say order by, take the current playlist data, and then I want to order by a different value. So in this case, it's released, and then it should be descending. So with order by takes a couple arguments. So order by first takes the argument of the data that you're looking to sort. Then the first one is the key. And so this is the key in the object. And then lastly, we need to pass in the actual direction. By default, it's ascending. So I need to say I want it in descending order. And then we're just going to do the exact same thing if it's oldest, except we're going to switch it to ascending like that. And then it's also nice to have a default here. So in other words, if sort filter doesn't exist, or if it gets cleared out, which I'm going to show you how to do as well, then I want to change it, and I want the order to actually be by position. And we don't, like I said, we don't even need the ascending in there because that's the default. So that is all you need to do to be able to reorder those values. Now, all we have to do now is add in our select filter. So I want to first check for the view. So I'm going to say if view to show is equal to grid, I want to show the select filter. And then if not, I don't want to show anything at all. And that's part of the reason I did that, is just to show you that you could do that with not just other nested components like the playlist data, the do not or the drag and drop. I want to show you can do it with any component, and we can control that state. So now that we have that, now let's actually call that select component. So inside of the select component, we're going to pass in some values. So first, we're going to pass in the options. And for the options, those are the, if I can remember the name, there we go, sort options. And then we also want to have whatever the selected value is. And let me see. Yes, it's just value. And for that, it's going to be our sort filter value. And for right now, we're not actually going to have this functioning quite yet. Let's just see if this is working. Okay, there we go. Perfect. So we're on our grid and it's showing us that. And if I switch, it goes away. Perfect. And we have our values all there. Now notice when I select this, nothing changes. And it also doesn't change the select box. That's because we need to build out a click handler or a on change handler. So on change is going to be pretty easy. We're just going to be able to call our setter for setting the sort filter. I'm also going to add a placeholder here. So for placeholder, let's say something like sort by release date. And now come back. And so it sorts by release date. Now let's try it. So if I click on newest, there we go. And click oldest, that's working perfectly too now. One thing that isn't here yet is what happens if we actually want to change this. So what happens if we want to clear it out? Well, there is a cool little prop for that called is clearable, and we're just going to set it to true. If you're kind of curious on why some of these values or some of these props needed an equal sign and then some kind of value, is clearable any type of prop in React that is a Boolean, and that's exactly what is clearable is. You can actually pass in just the prop name and it will automatically be true. So is clearable, typing it out like this is exactly the same as saying is clearable is true. So that's just kind of a shorthand way of writing that out. So when I add is clearable and come back here, nothing looks like it's changed, but if I click on oldest, now you'll see we have this little X. If I click that, then it clears it out. And notice it also changed our sort order when we did that. So that is working beautifully. We now have a fully functioning component or set of components that allows us to have a dynamic layout. We have the ability to change sort order. We have the ability to change layouts at the click of a button. And we have the ability to do all of it by leveraging React Router, and that which allows us to have fully stateful and for the system to maintain its state even between page refreshes. So that is something I think is pretty cool. If you ever wanted to kind of extend the functionality of this, and this would be kind of a cool piece of homework for you if you wanted to take what we just built out and say you wanted to maintain the filter, the sort filter state, you could also do that in between page refreshes. And so we're not going to do it now because we're just about out of time, but you could implement that by doing pretty much exactly what we did here with the params. You could go into the router, add another optional param here. So you could add, something like sort param, make it optional. And then you could grab that sort param value and you could store that as well. And then you could keep track of all of that data. So that is, I think, pretty cool. I hope that everybody got a lot out of that. Like I've said, if you've watched any of the workshops up until this point, some of my top goals when I'm coming up with the concepts to teach for these is I want to give you something that you're not just learning something cool or fun with React. That is definitely one of the big priorities, but I also try to pick out features and topics for different things that are very commonly asked for when you're building out applications so that you can reference this type of code. You can come right back to this code repo if you're like, oh, I just got asked to implement this sorting filter in a list, or I need the ability to change between layout views and maintain that, then you can come right to one of these repos, copy and paste the code, and have it live in a few minutes.